the Supreme Court ruling. It was a year ago, almost to the week that we last spoke. What are your thoughts on the implementation of said ruling?
The funny thing about the ruling, in a way, was it wasn't meant to have any implication for, how things would change. It was a clarification of the law. The problem has been that people have sat on that clarification as though it's like the most complicated, you have to be a kind of nuclear physicist to understand it type of thing. One of the things that's been depressing, I suppose, in light of how important that clarification was that very straightforward matters like the Equality and Human Rights Commission bringing out interim guidance, which it sent to the government quite some months ago, and that came out fairly quickly after the Supreme Court, is that although that would be guidance that could help answer any difficulties, very straightforwardly explained the implications for the Supreme Court's clarification for any institutions in relation to the Equality Bill. Nonetheless, the government, for no apparent reason whatsoever, has refused to issue it as guidance, has sat on it, has said, oh no, we need to look at it again, we're going through the process. And the reason why this matters is that very typically maybe, or maybe predictably, but even I'm shocked at this, public sector, in particular organisations, but not only, have used that lack of guidance as an excuse to basically not implement the obvious outcomes of the Supreme Court in relation to single-sex spaces. So they've said, oh, well, we can't really look at the policies that we've got in place that actually are now clearly breaking the law because we're waiting for the guidance. And as a consequence of which, I think we've all become rather cynical and jaundiced by why the government is sitting on this guidance for so long. Is this a hold-up? Is there an attempt at some kind of a legal challenge? What's going on? And even though the government says, oh no, well, you should of course implement the law as clarified by the Supreme Court, I think only one university has changed its policies. NHS trusts, a lot of schools, a lot of private organisations. We've just had this ludicrous situation with the Girl Guides, where the Girl Guides have sort of very grumpily and reluctantly said, oh, right then, as an organisation, we're now going to stop trans girls, i.e. boys, joining the guides from September. Everyone has to leave who is in the guides, who is not a biological female. They've done it really reluctantly, saying, oh, we didn't do it beforehand because we didn't feel we had to, because we were waiting for the guidance. They've now kind of backed off from that. But it just means that rather than it being a straightforward change that would clarify things, in some ways it's been used to muddy the water even further.
Yes. And to that point about the Girl Guides, this was a clarification of the law. It was not a new law. This has always been the law. And I think it's really Stonewall guidance that's muddied the waters. I think the Girl Guides, was it 2016 that they then started admitting boys and, more disturbingly, leaders, so trans-identifying males. These are girls, often girls' first forays away from home, coming of age. And it's such a clearly safeguarding issue. I can't understand how obvious it was. So when you look at that, they've operated under false pretenses for all of these years. My initial thoughts were, once that clarification came through last year, it was what people were waiting for. It was what these organisations were waiting for. They could get away from the activists because they were, well, it's the law. So what I'm really confused about is, well, a couple of things, is why they are still dragging their heels. But more importantly, you look at the NHS. Obviously, I had the Darlington nurses on with us last week, and they were amazing. And even now, when I hear that the NHS still spent £600,000 challenging that case when the Supreme Court ruling had already come through. So it's, why has the Girl Guides changed and others haven't? So that makes me question why some have and some haven't, NHS haven't. And why is Bridget Phillipson a year on? This would have been a wonderful anniversary, wouldn't it? To say, right, this is clear. I understand as well that the ECHR guidance was through, wasn't it? And by September had been amended and was ready to go. So why are they allowed to get away with it?
So a number of things there. I mean, let's start with the Girl Guides. I think that you're absolutely right. First of all, there was a safeguarding issue because it meant that Girl Guides leaders could have been, and in many instances were, men identifying as women, working with predominantly young girls. But if that isn't a safeguarding issue, I don't know what is, right? Because as you rightly described, I was like lots of people, I was in the brownies and the guides, and it's, the first time you go away from home is you go camping. It's probably the first time I went away from my family, stayed the night, and you're kind of like cooking baked potatoes over a fire. It's all very exciting. But you're also, I remember being like thinking, I'm not going to be homesick. But I was homesick. And you're like 11 or 12, and you're a bit like anxious. And you're looked after by these guiding leaders who are impeccably trustworthy women who took care of you. And I'm afraid that you wouldn't feel the same if your 11-year-old went away with a man identifying as a woman, and all of the confusion that comes with that. That's the first thing. Secondly, there's a bit of a tragedy here in terms of a different kind of safeguarding, which is the lies that we've told to the children. Because the Girl Guide said, oh, well, we didn't want to change it because, and I heard a discussion on Times Radio exactly to this point, the children weren't objecting. Well, of course they weren't objecting because they've been socialized into believing that you can choose which body you have. And, one of the tragic things here is that young boys who may have been a bit feminine, a bit effeminate, as used to be described, or what have you, said, well, I were encouraged by adults, either their parents or in school, to imagine that meant that they weren't a boy, but that they were a girl. And when they were encouraged to do that, then they think that that's what the solution is to maybe the fact that they're a bit shy, or that they like ballet, or they prefer playing with teddies and dolls than Action Man, or going out and roughing it, or whatever the reason was, right? That somehow they've been told this absolute lie by adults that means that they do believe that they should be in the Girl Guides.
Yeah.
And so in a way they are sad, because they've been cajoled and sort of socialized and incited in some instances to believe that this is where they'll be happy, and that they'd be frightened to go into a boys only environment because they wouldn't know how to cope. In other words, we abandoned their fears as little boys about being with other little boys in a male only space, and told them the solution for that was to pretend to declare that they're a girl. And so then the biological little girls are told, if they look round and say, the lad who was Johnny, who's now Janet, who, is now in our guides group, or right. And so you're going away on your camping trip, and there's Johnny, now Janet, sleeping in the same tent as you. And whether you like it or not, it's a boy. But if you're a bit anxious as the little girl, you're told that you're not being kind and you're not being nice and that you're being intolerant. And then you either leave the guides, or you think, oh, this is what it means to be a nice, kind young lady, and you tolerate having men in a single sex space. Now, the thing is, There's no, you could say, well, what's wrong with boys and girls going away together? That's fine. But this is the girl guides, called the Girl Guides, even though they changed their name to Guiding, that is for girls. And once you declare it's a single-sex organisation, which, by the way, the Scouts don't, and that's mixed, then you have to stick with that. That's what the law has clarified. Now, when you say, why did they change? I think that there was a real fight in the Girl Guides amongst the trustees, amongst the people at the top, and they decided that they'd comply with the law. And as a charitable trust or as a more private enterprise, they were worried about the potential legal implications of not. And it took some doing, a lot of publicity, a lot of Mumsnet activity, a lot of media activity and exposure for them to eventually decide that they would and as I said, they brought out a rather churlish, reluctant statement, but they have done it. Yeah. But when you talk about NHS trusts and, the university sector or the public sector, the point is they are state-run sectors, and in many ways they just are oblivious to. They feel as though they're untouchable and they're oblivious to any potential legal threats. That's how they feel. I think something else has happened in the public sector, and I'll just finish with this bit, which is that the public sector in particular took the original Stonewall equality, diversity and inclusion guidance very seriously. I mean, this is one bit of guidance they really took seriously. Everybody went on training courses, and in many instances, organisations like NHS trusts or even schools thought, well, we don't really understand all this trans stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in some people who are going to give us help at understanding it. And they kind of go out and they get these people to come in and do training courses. And we're going to employ people in our HR department to help us implement our trans inclusive policy. And so you then got a population of professional pro-trans inclusion, quite senior staff. And if you listen to the Darlington nurses, I think you can see that it's at that HR level that you had a real problem. This is then backed up at the time by the Labour Party, who were in opposition, but with the great supporters of the public sector, who were going along with this notion of EDI and trans, and this is what being kind and progressive equals. And then the trade union movement, which has bought into this lock, stock and barrel. So you're then, all the public sector trade unions are also going along with it. So in some ways you can see it's much harder to dislodge, is what I'm trying to say, from those kind of organisations, because they feel as though they're on a progressive mission. And that, I suppose, answers the Bridget Phillipson question, which is, despite the rhetorical commitment to the Supreme Court, there's a huge amount of pressure in the Labour Party, which is now in government, even though it's clarified its position on single-sex spaces as a Labour government, and it's become much less, what people would say, woke in relation to this issue, they're nonetheless under an enormous amount of pressure. They're now under pressure, of course, from the Green Party, which is fully endorsing of the notion that sex is not biological, that gender can be chosen, and they're trying to keep that lot happy. They're trying to keep their left flank happy. They're very conscious of the fact that trade unions are looking elsewhere. And so even if Bridget Phillipson individually feels committed to implementing this, they are, I'm afraid, prepared to sacrifice women's rights on the pragmatic basis of votes at the next election or in the May elections and so on.
So a couple of things there, Claire, and it's something we hear a lot. The fact that these NHS, these public sector organisations and lots of private, corporate businesses did it, had to actually employ a team of people to dissect the trans thing because it was so complicated. And listening to Bridget Phillipson this week talking about how, there's still, it's not clear. And even when I was chatting to the Darlington nurses, it's so clear it is the least complicated issue in the world, which is why we all feel like there's a mass gaslighting going on, because this simple solution, back to the Darlington nurses, as they were telling me, I always try to, when I'm interviewing people, imagine I've just come to it and I'm listening to it for the first time. And the thing that was just jumping and screaming out at me was, well, why didn't the guy go in the separate room? If there was just him and everybody else objected, in polite society, you would excuse yourself. You would go, I don't want to offend or hurt anyone. I will take myself off. It's really that simple. How women have been the ones to bear the responsibility of these men who are self-identifying into these spaces. It's so simple to me, Claire. Am I missing something? That surely the third space or the extra accommodation should be within the male estates, the male bathrooms, the male changing rooms, because isn't the responsibility on male violence is between them?
Exactly. You're absolutely, but it is simple.
Yeah.
But I think that what's not simple is unpicking the institutional depth that this has gone. And that's why I was sort of emphasising the bringing in the consultants type thing, because you've got this layer upon layer. So let me use an example. I recently went to a picket outside Story House, which is a theatre in Chester. Yeah. And, it's been a great theatre over the time. Anyway, it's basically employed a number of artistic directors who want to queerify the programme. But one of the things that they've done recently is they've had a sort of craft session as part of Pride for 3 to 7 year olds. And so there was, 3 to 7 year olds. So that, there's a protest outside, which I was speaking at. And a lot of parents were like, well, what's this protest about? Because, if you live around here in Chester or, North Wales, and you come to Story House, it's like, oh, this is a nice thing to take the kids to, a craft making thing. And to be honest, a lot of them don't particularly know what price of pictures of rainbows aren't going to put you off, are they? You're not going to necessarily read the iconography unless you're following this carefully. So they're bringing their kids to this, not out of some kind of militant political thing, but because they've got a 4-year-old who's bored and they want to do a craft session with them, right? Obviously, the fact that it's Pride is political. But anyway, so you can understand that the parents aren't necessarily kind of willfully doing it. Some of them were more militant, I have to say, were being political about it, but most of them weren't. But the staff in the theatre, were kind of blatantly like demonstrating their progressive credentials by hosting this, and they've got Macbeth on at the same time, which, by the way, they've interpreted through the queer prism. So inevitably, the 3 witches are, gender, non-binary and non-specific, and all the rest of it, right? It's like so naff apart from anything else. But anyway, that's one side. The reason I'm saying that is because Chester City Council and, Story House gets council money, right? And the City Council had the week before been approached about this. One of the councillors, former councillor Mandy Clare, had kind of raised it, and there was people going down and talking to them. And the councillors were absolutely outraged, because they basically believe that they've embraced this progressive new way of doing things. And the thing that really strikes me about these councillors, who are not like au fait with this issue at all, is that they've all the councillors, all the Story House team, all the rest of it, they've all been on these training courses where they believed that, we had these backward attitudes, and now we're kind of getting with the programme. And as you say, they need to go on training, because working through the language, the intricate details of 63 genders, all the things that you have to do to be trans inclusive, you need to go on 16 training courses. But they've all invested lots of public money in going on these courses. They've got their certificates. Stonewall used to be the mark of a good employer. You'd get this proved that you were kind and inclusive, and everybody wanted it. And that's why the private sector did it exactly the same. They wanted to prove it. And I think that once you've invested that much in it, you've got 2 things that happen. One is you can't admit you got it wrong. And secondly, you get these kind of new converts who are like zealots.
Yeah.
So, no disrespect, but, Mrs. Smith and Mr. Jones, who've never given two thoughts about that particularly, went on a course and then they're like full of it and they're full of the language. You see with this, by the way, with the police who've been on these courses, and they all become like experts in it. And they start saying, I think you'll find that that's transphobic. I think you'll find that that language is offensive and not acceptable, and so on and so forth. Everybody's walking out with their pronouns at the end of their emails. Everyone's got their rainbow lanyards on. Everywhere they go, it's reinforced.
Yeah.
And so coming along and saying the Supreme Court has just clarified all this, and obviously the Supreme Court didn't clarify all of that, it clarified single-sex spaces. But for a lot of these people, it's become, in a way, almost like a new religion that they've embraced, and it's harder to break away. Now, for millions and millions of ordinary people in this country who've not been exposed to this ideology because they haven't been on the training courses, they're all thinking, what the hell's happened? But the public sector runs a lot of the United Kingdom. It's a public sector in Wales is the major employer. Everybody works in the public sector, so what you get is a sort of filtering down, and the education departments do the same. And the final example I'll give is I knew some people who worked in primary education, and when the religion, what is it, RSHE? I can't remember, but anyway, it's like the equivalent of teaching people sex education in schools. When the new guidance came out, and this was under the Tories, remember, they had to introduce a lot of these notions of gender identity into teaching. And you're there, primary school head or teacher, used to dealing with 7-year-olds, and suddenly you got and you think, I haven't got a clue what this is, right? So you ask a local activist group to come in and help you. So you get Mermaids to come in, who's now a charity that's been discredited, or Stonewall to come in, and there's all these particular charities that go in, or the local pride organisers that have been taken over by trans activists. They go in and they tell these new teachers, or not these teachers, who again have never really thought about it, this is the way that you're going to make children happy and feel comfortable in themselves. And you have to do it, because if you don't, you're going to be accused of being a bigot and sacked. And a few people were accused of being bigots and sacked, and so that became the lesson. And so suddenly, from year dot, kids are being basically not brainwashed, but introduced indoctrinated way beyond their years, because they're little dots and they don't know what they're doing, and the teachers are all involved in it, and so it's very hard to actually hold back this. Even when the Supreme Court makes a declaration, everyone's been on the training courses, everyone's bought into it. And a lot of parents are looking aghast and shocked at what's happening to their children in classrooms, but they're just treated as though they're ignorant, backward type of people who haven't been on one of the training courses, so they don't know what's right and what's wrong.
Yes. And to your point there, it does become like a religion, because it's almost like these people have never thought about it before. And we all know that these activist groups don't just say, well, these people are confused or whatever it is. They're really quite inflammatory with their language, aren't they? And they will give all the false stats about how trans people are the most, affected by crime and suicide. And they're all, it's not true, a lot of it. And I think, and as you were talking there, money talks, doesn't it? And when such a big investment's been made and jobs created out of this ideology to unpick that. Another thing as well, and it comes back to one of our pet subjects, is free speech, because if you said, people who've challenged it have been punished and they've lost their jobs and their pensions. That was one of the things about all of the public sector women, and there's still cases ongoing, who have been so brave to take this on, because they are potentially risking their pensions, aren't they? Their qualifications, the whole thing about being cancelled. So it leads to, if we can't discuss, if we can't say what a woman is, and if we can't have that really rational conversation, well, why would you put a grown man in a camping situation with a young girl unsupervised, or why would you put a man on a ward in with vulnerable women? It is crazy when you say it out loud that people go, well, you can't say that or whatever. So when you look at this government and their clampdown on free speech that we do have going on at the moment, where do you think this ties in with the amount of, well, I was checking on your work, Claire, the amount of bills going through the Lords at the moment, it's like they're rushing them through. What do you think is going on? For all of Keir Starmer's, and I heard Bridget Phillipson say last night on Camilla Tominey, we have free speech, you're allowed. And she was defending I think it was the head of the teachers' union, who was openly being really quite vilely anti-Semitic, was marching with Islamists. And she was quite happy for him to have his free speech and said, well, we don't thought police in this country. Really? So where do you think this all fits in with that wider picture?
Well, I think one of the problems is we all feel constantly that we're being gaslit, don't we? I mean, when you were describing, why would you let a man into that situation? I mean, that's it. You just committed a transphobic hate crime because it's not a man, it's a woman. It's a trans woman. And until recently, you couldn't say a man who identifies as a woman. You had to say trans woman, and a trans woman is a woman. And you weren't allowed to say anything else. And so consequently, you feel like you're losing your mind because you go, and there was that case of, I can't remember what football, where it was in the country. I think it was in the Northwest in Manchester, but the young teenage girl who was playing in the girls' team, great footballer, apparently she was. Yeah. And she's somebody who's got issues in relation to autism, and so maybe wasn't as careful in pretending like everybody else. So when a boy joined the girls' team, she said, that's a man.
Yeah.
He was then kicked out of the team, not the man who identifies as a woman. And she was then disciplined by the Football Association. I mean, some teenager in the Northwest, humiliated because she said what we all know to be true. But the rest of us would, walking on eggshells, go out of our way to maybe be a little bit cautious about what we said. And it's only in instances like with the Darlington nurses where it was like a physical thing. We just said, no, I'm not getting changed in front of that person. That it kind of came out. But as you'll know, you've talked to them, they weren't political. They weren't trying to cause a fuss. That was just a practical conflict. But I think for lots of the time, we've all gone along with it. You say LGBTQ plus without, I said it for years without even knowing what the plus, I didn't even know. Each time they added something on, I didn't know what it was. Because it's like, it gives you permission to speak, to just like go along with a lot of stuff rhetorically. And you say trans woman and you'd think, oh, well, I'll use the she, her pronouns because I don't want to be impolite and all the rest of it. And then you realize that actually you're being forced in a way, coerced into say what you know not to be true. And that makes it very difficult. And I recently had a briefing with somebody who works in adult gender medicine. And I asked this very senior person, I said, well, when somebody comes and says, and you're negotiating with them whether they're going to be given permission to have NHS surgery, I said, don't you say to them, well, you can't become a woman. I mean, when the man says, I want to have the surgery so that I'll be a woman, surely as a clinician, you should say, well, that's not possible. I mean, I can do surgery that might pretend that you are to remove your male genitalia and to put in imitation bits and bobs so that it looks or apes, but you won't be a woman. So I asked this question and there was like a real silence, because even in that instance, even though this particular person was very sympathetic to a gender critical position and was not one of the bad people at all, it's very sensitive, But you could just see, but I was saying, as a doctor, a medical expert, surely we should be able to say to adults who say, I was wait, no. I mean, we should say that to children as well, because otherwise we're misleading them. But we don't. We've all pussyfooted round. So I just think there's that going on. And that matters because the free speech issue has been this sort of insidious cultural norms that we have to not offend anyone, that we have to be very careful about what we say. And there's a hidden threat. As you say, you can lose your job, your pension, and I think your reputation. I mean, if you're called a bigot at work, and of course this could fall under the category of being called Islamophobic or what have you, because you've made some criticism of the grooming gangs. It's not just this one issue, but this issue has been particularly damaging, I think, to free speech, because the Stonewall doctrine, actually, their slogan was no debate.
Yeah.
That if you challenge them, they said that you wanted to eradicate and erase trans people, and then you became guilty of some kind of war crime, as though you're kind of trying to get them erased off the earth and so on. And so the no debate became an issue, which was you weren't allowed to ask this question, and anyone who even hovered around a bit of skepticism, like, do I really have to have my pronouns in when it's obvious I'm she, her, or this is bonkers, or why are we doing this? They could be suspended, and then I've known people. I'm sure you have, but I've known people, particularly in the public sector, who, for different reasons, not just this happens when you're suspended from a job as a teacher or a nurse or whatever. They literally send you home for months and months and months. They don't even tell you what you're accused of. You can't find anything out. People have real stress-related illnesses because they can't. It's horrible. And you're also told you're not allowed to talk to anyone at work. You're not allowed to discuss the case. So you're absolutely terrified.
Yeah.
Not only might you lose your job, but everyone at work's going, where the hell's, so-and-so gone, so-and-so. And there's like a dark cloud, it must be suspicious, no smoke without fire.
Yeah.
So we've had that level of informal compliance by fear and setting these terrible examples of making sure that one person is absolutely humiliated in public so that everybody else in the company or in the organization goes, just don't speak, don't open your mouth, zip it. I say to everyone I love, don't say it. I mean, I tell people don't speak, and I'm a free speech person because I know the implication of, some 23-year-old from the family saying what they think might get them into trouble and they'll lose their job. So we basically walked around with that threat. Then, in the meantime, the laws that have been introduced, one layer after another, are always this notion that speech is as harmful as action. And harmful speech is used constantly to police what we say, particularly online. We've seen the huge number of people arrested for writing the wrong thing online. And even though they're often the majority, who are arrested aren't charged, nonetheless, the police turn up at your door. Again, it's like the humiliation. The police cars come and drag you out with all your computers. Immediately, everybody thinks that you're, storing images of children and paedophilia, or you've just joined, Hamas or something, right? It's like serious. The fact that they then quietly return all your computers 6 weeks later and they don't charge you isn't the point. So, of course, it means that people are very frightened of the law. The police have become overzealous in interpreting that. And the Labour government, just to finish off, to go back to exactly what you say, we have a Labour government that within about 2 weeks of getting into power, despite some optimism that they would be a refreshing change from the previous collapse of the Conservative Party, which had, let's be honest, lost the support of the public in terms of ruling and were rightly, in my opinion, punished at the last election, replaced by this new broom. And even if you didn't particularly like Keir Starmer in Labour, you thought, well, at least something might be a bit of life and enthusiasm. Anyway, within a few weeks, we all suddenly realised they were useless. Not only useless, but double standards left, right, and centre with the corruption stuff, tickets for this, that, and the other, free glasses, free clothes, all that blather. But also, between the riots and various other things, we started to realise that their instinct, the greatest instinct that Keir Starmer and his cabinet had, was to clamp down on the public's right to speak freely and to demonise anyone who didn't go along with it. They're now and the economy's, all the growth, the houses, all that's not delivered. So we all know that, don't need to go through. Their way of trying to assert control as they've lost complete respect throughout the country and have, plummeted in the polls, is the one place that they've got some control is pushing through legislation. Law upon law upon law upon law. And I can't keep up, and I'm there, but I can only do a tenth of what they're pushing through. And a lot of what they're pushing through is anti-free speech, completely illiberal, going to really damage our capacity to speak freely. And I'm afraid it's a very scary regime they're setting up for whoever takes over. They're either going to have to repeal a lot of stuff, or it's going to be there on the statute books, and it scares the hell out of me.
Yeah, terrifying. And this is a question, really, Claire, about how are they allowed to just keep bringing law after law in? We were told there wasn't going to be this ludicrous Islamia law, and then they try and bring it in as an anti-Muslim, which, do they think that we're all this stupid? I mean, that's probably one of the most insulting things. There was the abortion law, and I heard you speak on this, and I agree with you. I'm pro-life, and it's as soon as possible and as late as, I can't remember the phrase.
It's necessary, yeah.
Yeah, I'm uncomfortable with late-term abortions, but I do know there are exceptions. I wish there wasn't, but most disturbingly, the assisted dying bill. Again, I am somebody who, in theory, is in favour of assisted dying, and it was only until somebody challenged me on this and how actually ill thought through it is. And I think you made the point about a doctor would be obliged to say, have you thought about killing yourself? And doing it on Zoom, I had no idea all of that was in there. So again, there's a problem with language, isn't there? Because words don't mean the same anymore. Last year, we were talking about how actually being called a racist used to be one of the worst things anybody could ever level at you. It was mortifying. We had transphobia, same thing, all these words, no debate. They all just got meshed into this big homogenous blob. So you were terrified to say anything. But the more it seems that language is being diluted and the words are changing, the less easy it's going to be to understand what laws are coming through and how it affects speech.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Look, even with the Islamophobia thing, that isn't even a law. They're bringing it through as guidance, but it's highly recommended guidance. So they got out of it being a law by just saying, we've done a review, we're not calling it Islamophobia, as you say, it's now anti-Muslim hostility. It's not a law, so we're not doing anything to attack free speech, but it's guidance. But we're going to recommend that everyone adopts this guidance. And we've just talked about the Stonewall recommended guidance endorsed by governments, by the way, Conservative Party as much as anyone, that came through in the past. And the influence of guidance on policy in all of the public sector, which is, after all, huge swathes of the country, will mean that everyone is signing up to this guidance. And if anyone says anything that could possibly be interpreted as hostility to Muslims, then they'll be breaching the guidance, and therefore there'll be a problem. And every council will be sending people on training courses in how not to breach the hostility to Muslims guidance, right? So that this will have a chilling effect, especially on an issue which is so difficult because absolutely nothing to do with individuals who are Muslims.
Yeah.
But we know that there's a movement of people in this country who want to ensure that a particular version of Islam is one which is adopted locally, like guidance, but done in a different way, and becomes the dominant way of understanding things, and uses such issues to mean that there's no scrutiny of Islamism, which is a politicized form of Islam, and or cultural practices, which might well be safeguarding issues, could well be backward, and which anyway, we're entitled in a free society to say, I disagree with FGM, I don't like cousin marriage. You're allowed to say those things, even if somebody says, well, I disagree with you, what's wrong with it, right? That's fine. But this guidance will be used to shut people up. And that's guidance. Never mind the laws. The laws, you use a couple of examples, and we won't go into it in detail, but I am somebody who, just on the abortion question, because I think it is worth me saying this at least, it was very difficult because I did think that decriminalising the women, not the action, those women who, in one way or another, which is a very small, tiny number, like 5, 6, 7, 8 people who have been prosecuted and investigated, but that was the number prosecuted, but a lot more have been investigated and then not prosecuted because maybe they had a stillborn baby, or there was some ambivalence about what happened after the thing, that they were just persecuted by the police. I did think decriminalising them was worth it, but
yeah,
right. And that actually there was a danger of, anyway, I because it's almost like a whole different episode that we could maybe do another time, but I thought that was worth doing. However, I did object to the fact that it was pushed through attached to another bill, the crime and policing bill, because nobody had a chance to discuss it in the Commons. It then comes to the Lords. I raised all that, but ultimately I voted for it. I've had a lot of stick for that, let me tell you. Because people then say, oh my God, they've legalised abortion to birth, which is not actually what happened. But the reason why people are confused is because it wasn't accompanied by a proper public debate.
Yes.
And I do object to that. And I object, by the way, to those people on my side who are pro-choice, having tried to push it through the back door and the government allowing that to happen, and then telling the public that they just have to put up with it. So even though I was on that side, I didn't think the amendment was it as it's been presented, as now this legalizes abortion up to birth, because it doesn't. Because if any doctor or nurse or medical person or lay person helped somebody assisted somebody in an abortion after the legal deadline, they would be breaking the law and sent to jail. It was just the women themselves.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, it's just the women themselves who the police were turning up then with these, some 14, 15-year-old who didn't realise they were pregnant and then had a difficult birth and the baby died, and then the police turn up and they drag everyone off, and it's like it's the opposite of compassionate. But anyway, that's to one side. I do agree that the law was handled badly. And I also think that the law, as you say, the assisted dying bill, which is supposedly a private member's bill, but which Keir Starmer made it clear that he supported and promised Esther Ranson, a celebrity. I mean, what a way to do lawmaking, that he would ensure that this was something that was brought to Parliament and discussed. I mean, and the whole thing is an absolute disaster. And the point you've made, which I'm really pleased to hear, in a way, is what we've tried to do in the Lords, and what I try and do through the Academy of Ideas and putting up the films and the speeches, is to say to people, this lawmaking that's going on, you should hear what they're saying. Because on paper, saying everyone should have the freedom at the end of life to choose how they die sounds the most sensible thing in the world. But when you actually look at the actual contents of this bill, giving the state the authority by changing the rules of what it means to be a doctor in the NHS, to assist you in taking your own life by a doctor handing you lethal poison, and all in a hospital. And bear in mind, there's lots of elderly people who, will feel like they're a burden.
Yeah.
That's a different thing. And we should be discussing and debating those laws. But very often they don't get debated. You just hear the headline. And what drives me mad is when people say, Claire Fox argued against the Employment Rights Bill. She doesn't support workers' rights. And I think there was something like 300 pages in that bill. Have you read it all?
Well, I tried, yeah.
I don't know, but I'm saying there's a lot more in this bill. Nobody's going to plough through that. I don't blame anyone for not ploughing through it, but it's not just the headline. The crime and policing bill has got hundreds and thousands or hundreds and hundreds of clauses that are going to have real damaging impacts on free speech. Of course, if you say to somebody, do you oppose increasing the amount of policing and tackling crime? They're going to say, of course, I'm not opposed to that. But then you look at the detail. And so that's one of the things that I try and do is to, as much as I can, bring to light that. But the government, and this government in particular, they're like bullies. They're bulldozing laws through left, right, and centre because they know they're not going to be re-elected.
Yeah.
So they're literally irresponsibly pushing through badly written bills with badly written matters, because that means that then there's loads of unintended consequences, let alone what they intend. And a lot of the bills that, I suppose I've ranted. The final bit of this is they afford themselves a huge degree of power. So regardless of what you think about the ban on social media for under 16s, and I'm opposed to it, the Tories in opposition are really pushing this through. The government say, well, we don't know if we're going to ban under 16. So what we're asking now is they put an amendment forward that basically means that we have to hand over the power to government ministers, not just these ones, but anyone in the future, that they can decide what age range should be able to access not just social media, but the whole of the internet. Anything like WhatsApp groups or anything. But it's not, what they say is we hand the power over and then Parliament never even gets to decide it anymore. It's gone forever. And they keep doing that. Every bill they bring forward, they have what's known as delegated powers. We delegate the powers to government ministers to make decisions on our behalf. And it's supposed to be that you only do that in very, very, very limited circumstances. Increasingly, it's in every bill that all you do is you vote it through because you think, oh, it sounds all right, but you give the detailed power to a government minister to decide. And that is dictatorship in a way.
I mean, that's what, as you're saying that, I just think China, I just think controlling internet usage. And then it was about this self-ID. Someone, I can't remember who it was, who gave this example to people who were for it. Think of the worst politician, dead or alive, that ever lived that you would despise and be afraid of. Now imagine they had all of your data in one place and could control everything about your life, how many times you've been to the doctors, what you were eating, where you were traveling to, and that they had the power around it. As you say, it's not just who's in power now, it's who comes into power. And I think it might have been you, Claire, that told me about Tony Blair, that he enshrined things in law that we didn't realise at the time. You did, but the rest of us were all things can only get better. No, and actually, it was disastrous, and it's held us.
Because then we're told it's in the law and you can't change it. So like that's like say net zero targets. Net zero, you are legally obliged to reach them, right? That's what the law says, right? They didn't even have a vote on it in Parliament. It just that was a delegated power that got nodded through. So these things, that was a long time. Yeah, net zero. Or not the specifics, but the reduction. Yeah, that's where the legislation. So when things become law, and so this is why I'm saying about the ban on social media for under 16s, without going into the details of that. But one of the things that is, you say, well, of course, everybody who's ever dealt with a teenager thinks, oh, God, please take them off. I want them to not be, in this sewer of social media, and I can't stop them. So if I had a law, that'd be brilliant. The problem is, in order to identify who's 16 and who's 17 or who's 18, you have to age gate things, which means that adults have to prove how old they are as well. And the next minute, you have digital ID. You have you as an adult having to prove who you are through, sometimes photo ID or what have you, in order to get access to some website that is your private business, right? And yet we're calling on the law to enforce that we hand over our data in that way, or our age, and of course you can't prove your age unless you prove who you are.
Yeah.
But it's the end to anonymity, and there's all sorts of reasons why you might want to be anonymous. We've just started off talking about the difficulties in many instances of saying what you think in relation to the trans issue. So, of course, the people who work in those public sector organisations might want to be whistleblowers, might want to go out, I don't know, people who work around Chester City Council or the Storyhouse Theatre who disagree with the policy might want to say something. They might call themselves, Mrs. Turfy or something on social media so that they don't have to say...
Twitter handle, Claire.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a perfectly legitimate reason why they're anonymous. Suddenly their anonymity is going to be broken. So what looks like a sort of, this is just an argument, a bit of a scrap about how we should regulate and stop under 16-year-olds going online, actually becomes a much more dangerous set of powers given to politicians to implement surveillance, undermine our privacy, and ultimately has to be at least debated and discussed with much more depth than just saying, do you want to keep kids safe online by banning the internet for them? That's the problem. Is things are kind of like said to people and then the details never discussed.
I think I'm going to blame some of that on TikTok, actually. I read a really disturbing thing about how, most kids are getting their news from TikTok. And that leads me to wrap up on, I always like to end on a positive, Claire. Like, what can we do about this rot? I always think try and seek out long form conversations every time I speak to you, because I actually didn't know all of that about the social media, because I've been very conflicted with that, because I don't like things being banned, and then I think, should we hand this to tech companies, or will it be easy for parents? But you're right, we mustn't. We mustn't allow it. So what can we do? What can we tell people to do?
Yeah, well, first of all, just on a positive note, I suppose, if you want, even with young people, right, the majority of young people are not on social media being groomed by, sexual predators, and not on suicide sites, and not, either. I mean, a lot of time they're just having fun and being daft. But and I don't want them on social media all the time. But what's most amazing is that how many young people actually are on it. And you're saying, well, they get their news from TikTok. Quite a lot of them are actually getting alternative views of the world as well. As we're about to give the vote to 16-year-olds, I don't like the idea that the only information they should have before they get the vote is state sanctioned. And this idea that, we don't want, and I just saw a great clip actually, which was a Lib Dem MP, when I say great clip, a depressing one, where he said, the biggest problem we have with immigration is social media, because there's all these people who can now go on and say what they think about mass migration, and it's a disaster. And, in the past, we never had that. I thought, God, he said the quiet bit out loud there. But yeah, so I don't think it's all negative what young people are doing online. That's what I'm trying to say. A lot of them are connecting with each other. A lot of them are, think about, just with that being silly about it, but, those young Iranian protesters use social media. Before a lot of them were slaughtered by the regime. But what I mean is we knew their stories because of that. A lot of the campaigns that the Women's Rights Network doing with Afghani young girls, they're finding ways of using social media to get their stories out, even to get educated. So we just don't want to throw out babies and bathwaters. And I think young people as well are, and this is like a sign of hope, it seems to me, are bristling at the way that they have been raised to find everything offensive. And there's a lot of really inquisitive, politically curious, rebellious young people who are just saying, no, I don't want this one tone view of the world. And I think it's also very positive that a lot of young people now, a lot of young girls are now not signing up, by the way, for trans.
Yes.
It was a social contagion that's actually got less and less. You can see it sort of slightly dimming. And I do think that young people are a much more mixed bunch. And I always take great hope from that. And we run this project called Living Freedom for 18 to 30-year-olds. And we just inundated with a lot of young people just saying we don't want to go along with the orthodoxy. So I'm very positive about that. But the other thing is that I do think that this conversation, the kind of conversations that you and I have had before, but also that more and more people are having, is I don't think they can gaslight us. But I think it's become pretty clear that the political establishment, such as it is, and the mainstream parties in particular, just can't get away with pulling the wool over our eyes. We might not know exactly what they're up to, but I think more and more people are aware of the fact that they shouldn't take at first. They don't. We're not deferential in the same way, are we?
Yeah, that's
When
right.
they say this is the truth, we all go, might go and Google that. I might ask. I might ask Grok. I'm going to at least look. No, I might even read a different newspaper, or I might just go and find out, because I don't think that people are as prepared to go along with the kind of narrative. And I think that controlling the narrative has been what the establishment have been struggling with in the social media era. That's where they, like that MP admitting, damn, the problem is now they can speak out loud and they can read other people, and it's a disaster. We can't just give them news at 6, and hope they'll shut up. So the positive democratic instinct is that more and more people are not accepting this kind of manicured narrative that's very controlled, and I think we've seen real splits in that, and that's where we get the kind of different political parties emerging. I'm not saying they're the solution. I just mean you can see that people are just not going along with the kind of one version of the world. So that's very positive. And I suppose the other positive thing to say, because it's a bit of a scary world, we don't know whether we're on the brink of World War III, a major recession, is we've got to create, and I think this is something which I'm passionate about, an atmosphere of solidarity. And we've got to be prepared to be honest with each other and frank and open and not frightened of saying the wrong thing. And no, I think that one of the most important things is a sense of solidarity amongst us all. I think we've got to be prepared to have some, sometimes brutally honest conversations with each other, but we've got to talk to each other. I mean, I've been having quite a lot of run-ins with people because I have always argued that the way that people are labelled as racist or what have you is far too promiscuous and has been used to shut down debate. People think that then that means that I'm not prepared to say, no, actually, that's racist when somebody is racist.
Yeah.
And then as soon as I say, and if I say something's racist, at least, I'm not saying it just to shut them down. I'm just saying, look, I really disagree with you. I do think that's, a vile thing to have said. You're literally judging people on the colour of their skin and saying that they're inferior, right? That's very different to a conversation about the problems of mass migration. That's very different to problems of a lack of integration or social cohesion. Anyway, that sort of thing. And then people say, oh, you've said racism, but everybody says racism. And, and how dare you? And you're now part of the controlled opposition and you're like pinko liberal. And I think that actually what we don't need is that those of us who have fought long and hard against an official narrative and making sure that we don't just go along with one line of argument also shouldn't be shut down by our fellow citizens because they've decided we're not saying the wrong thing, we're not saying the right thing, or that there is a right and wrong thing to say. I think we've got to be much more open-minded. And I think there's an appetite for that. But we've got to also just maintain that. We're going to have citizens in this country are going to have a tough few years ahead. And I think we need to be able to get on the phone, if that's what you do, get on social media, have a Zoom chat, get together at things like the Battle of Ideas Festival, but not just the Battle of Ideas, so get together and politics in pubs meetings or local salon get-togethers and say, what the hell do you think's happening? And have arguments with each other when we think we're wrong. When we think somebody, and of course, we've abandoned doing that with the young. We've far too easily said that when young people say, I want this and I believe this, and we've gone, oh, all right then. And so even when young people say, I think I'm the opposite sex, we go, oh, all right then. And we don't say anything, but also a sort of sense of entitlement in the young that has allowed them to almost bully older people, and adults have not stood up to that kind of childish, immature sense of entitlement. But I also think we've stopped being hard on each other. And I don't mean hard on each other like trying to get people shot to the police or banned off things, but actually just being open and honest and frank, and sometimes saying, I don't know the answer. I'm not sure. Let's talk about it next week. Let's keep in touch. I think that sort of open conversation and sense of us taking responsibility, because the politicians aren't going to do it. And if we rely on them, then we become passive bystanders. And I think we've got to start taking responsibility for the society we live in so that we start to be a bit clearer what it is we expect from the politicians once they're elected, but that we very much treat them as our servants, not the other way around. They've
forgotten that.
They work for us. And of course, I'm one of them, so I can't talk. But anyway, there you go.
You do good work, though, Claire. But and we've just had the Olympic. The IOC has on another good news story for us. Finally, men are out of the women's categories. I did have somebody.
That's fantastic, isn't it?
Oh, it's massive, a real one. I had a troll tell me that my feelings were not more important than biological, some nonsense about science. And I was like, what about the IOC? It's another...
it's fantastic. That has been one of the best news stories. Amazing. By the way, I think there are, on April the 11th, all around the country, there's, anniversary of the Supreme Court gatherings, and there is one in Manchester. I think it's at 1:00. But anyway, I'm going to try and come along to that. So if anyone's listening, but I think that is part of that. And I think the reason I'm saying that, I was reminded, was because one of the things that we will be celebrating on April the 11th in the gathering is the IOC decision, because the sports decision, I think, has been so cruel and ridiculous over the years. But it was also so illogical. It just didn't make any sense. I mean, if you have women's sports and men's sports, you have to know who are the women and who are the men. And the muddling that has been absolutely disastrous, and disastrous for so many women who've been deprived of places in teams, medals, being on the winning side and so on, because men had taken their places. And then any of us who said that were treated again like bigots. So how fantastic that victory has happened.
Yeah, I think the Imam Khalif for me was my absolute and really the end of any credibility for the BBC, to celebrate watching women getting beat up by what was so clearly a man. He wasn't even pretending to be trans.
And he wasn't even pretending. Well, I wasn't. Listen, I didn't pretend. He's sort of mad. I mean, I'm not saying that would make any difference, but you do think, make an effort.
I know. On his trainer's shoulders and stuff. And anyway, so really positive news for us there, Claire. And like I said, just keep being curious. I do want to give a plug to the Battle of Ideas, because it is just the people that I tell about when I return. I am so full of it when I get back. And I think it's really unusual for people to hear about these types of robust discussions in a really, I don't want to say safe environment, in an open environment where debate is welcome, respectful disagreement is welcomed, because I always come back and I always take a notepad with me. I feel like a real nerd when I'm sat in the sessions, because I just scribble down notes. So I think, it's gold, So there is always one in London in October, but you did have a northern one, didn't you, that I saw you at a couple of weeks ago, which was fantastic. Will there be another northern one coming up, do you think?
We hope so, yes. That's certainly the plan, and it will be bigger and better. I mean, we sold out this year. We had a waiting list of about 100 people, so we're going to come back bigger. But listen, the other thing I wanted to say to you is, I did think when I saw you looking out when I was chairing, is we must get you on a panel.
Oh,
You're up
yeah,
for
I'd
it.
love to. Yeah, I'd
Would
love
you?
to.
Right.
Yes, I will.
I'm following that up then. All right, well, we'll get you on a panel. I'd love to have you as a speaker, and we can work out on what topics. But, but I was thinking about doing something on the media, and I thought, oh, I must actually see if you'd be up for that. But anyway, we can discuss
Yeah,
that another time. But look, the point is, what the Battle of Ideas tries to do is just public debates and conversations and discussions, is it tries to just bring that spirit of, we're not, it is a safe space, but it's not a safe space if everyone agrees. It's safe for you to say what you think. And if somebody disagrees with it, they're not going to kind of try and get you arrested or flounce off in a fit. It's more like it's safe in a safe space for you to raise the issues that you think are important. That's what matters.
yeah, brilliant, Claire. Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed our chat today.
Thank you.